Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it has been a dramatic past, I'd say, 10 days or so in Zimbabwe, of all places. And there has been, from last week to this week, we're not going to, I don't know, do we call this a coup? It's not really a coup. It's kind of like a coup light. But there has been a military overthrow of the Mugabe government, something that we had not anticipated that we would have seen. Now, what's very interesting from our point of view here at the China and Africa podcast is the connection with China. Now, it's interesting because China has had this very, very complex relationship with Zimbabwe and Robert Mugabe. And it's been this relationship that dates back decades and decades. In fact, the Chinese always referred to Mugabe as an old friend. And that goes all the way back to China's revolutionary period during the Mao era, in fact. And over the past, say, 20, 30 years, China was that old friend that stood by while the rest of the world isolated and attempt to alienate Robert Mugabe, as he, reciprocated as well. And there was this tension with the Europeans and the Americans, but the Chinese continued to provide aid to some extent, certainly weapons, and at the same time political support that he didn't get anywhere else. But over the past, say, 4 or 5 years, maybe, Cobus, there was a cooling in the relationship. Mugabe, desperate for cash, went to China. He left empty-handed. Investment from China into the mines. And also, of course, we had the case of Sam Pa, who was the corrupt or allegedly corrupt deal maker between the Chinese and Africans. He, too, was involved in Zimbabwe. He got ensnared in Xi Jinping's anti-corruption crackdown. All of this related to Chinese engagement in Zimbabwe, but it started to chill a little bit. And Cobus, we saw a distancing of the relationship over the past couple of years, which really makes it interesting what we're going to talk about today.
China kept calling Mugabe an old friend. They kept paying lip service to this relationship. But in reality, the relationship got more and more frosty as time went on. And you got the feeling that Zimbabwe was maybe a little bit problematic for the Chinese, and also that there were worries in China about the sustainability of Zimbabwe's economy and the repayment of large Chinese loans. So now it's, the coup raises all of these questions, including what's going to happen with Zimbabwe in the future and what China's role is going to be.
Now, the Chinese had anticipated the day that Robert Mugabe eventually would step down from power. Most people thought, of course, that he would die in office. That was the assumption that people had up until a week ago. This came as very much a surprise for a lot of people. In fact, the Chinese had already been building relationships with Morgan Tsvangirai from the MDC and other opposition parties, dating back as far as 2012, when they invited Tsvangirai to Beijing. And that was seen as a real break, because it really was this visible sign to the Mugabe government that the Chinese were hedging their bets and wondering what happens when Mugabe leaves. Will the Chinese be locked out of a new Zimbabwe government? But now we have this situation where Mnangagwa is really a continuity in sense from the Mugabe government. He's not a new power. He's not the opposition. But before we get to our guest today, let's kind of highlight one very important point here. And this is what so much of the speculation about China's role has focused on. 1 week before what are we calling it, Cobus? Is it a coup? Is it not a coup?
I think we can just probably call it a coup. I mean, that's what people have been calling it.
Okay, we'll call it a coup for shorthand. A coup has a slightly different definition. But Zimbabwe Army Commander Constantino Chiwenga went to Beijing. And this is what's so interesting, because nobody knows what exactly was said. Did he go there with the intention to inform the Chinese, to get a blessing? The Chinese allege that this was part of a regularly scheduled military visit that happens, and that this was just normal state-to-state business. They deny that they were involved in any way. There is absolutely no evidence to suggest that the Chinese in any way either sanctioned, organized, were involved in what happened in Zimbabwe. That does not mean they were not informed in advance to either get their pulse or to tell everybody, chill out, it's all going to be okay. Incidentally, there are reports coming out now that Chiwenga's forces also informed the United States, and we don't know if they engaged the British as well. So that is the the background to what's been a very dramatic past week, and we wanted to get some perspective on what this means. Where do we go from here now with a new government under the control of Emmerson Mnangagwa and presumably Constantino Chiwenga in atop the military? So we've invited actually Cobus's boss, his new boss, Stephen Grusz, who's the head of governance and foreign policy programs at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He's been a longtime follower of Zimbabwean politics. And Stephen, we are thrilled to have you on the show for the first time.
Thank you very much. I look forward to chatting to you guys.
Well, my head is spinning from all the things that we've just been talking about because so much has happened over the past week. Now that we have a new president in power, a president, incidentally, who also has a long-standing relationship with China as well, what's your forecast for where we go from here in Zimbabwe? What are we to expect now over the coming weeks and months?
So he was inaugurated earlier today, in fact, about an hour ago at the time that we're talking. And he was making the right noises in his inauguration speech. He talked about the need for reconciliation, that he was going to be a president for all of Zimbabwe and not only the ruling ZANU-PF, that the economy had to be tackled and very seriously, that jobs need to be created. He called on civil servants to put their shoulders to the wheel and work hard. He also said that the land reform, the rapid land reform and the confiscation of farms that happened in the early 2000s could not be reversed. But he did talk about compensation. So I think most significantly for our purposes, he also reached out to the international community, said that Zimbabwe needs to be given a chance and that the sanctions need to be lifted and that Zimbabwe needs to be reintegrated, my words, not his, into the family of nations. Let's let bygones be bygones and have a new start and a fresh start, and reverse the isolation that the country has faced over so many years, particularly from the West.
Now, Cobus, let me just quickly come to you very quickly for a China perspective on what Stephen has talked about. When he's trying to talk about inviting investment into Zimbabwe, this is a country that is probably, and again, I might be overstating it, but it's not really ripe for investment right now. It's got a lot of potential, certainly tobacco, agricultural, diamond mining. There's a lot there. There's not a lot of countries or companies that may have the stomach for it. Certainly China is already primed to go. The British probably are not really eager to be there. They want to see what happens. Talk to us a little bit about the China side of all this.
I think the British might be more enthusiastic than they look. Like they've kept relatively close. I think Stephen will know more about this than I do, but they've kept relatively close, contact with Zimbabwe even in the difficult years. But would like Stephen, feel free to expand on that. In terms of China. China already has quite large investments in Zimbabwe, but they were in lots of cases especially in the case of the Marange diamond fields, they weren't normal investments, or let me rather say they were complicated investments that had a lot of Zimbabwean stakeholdership, and then they underwent a process of indigenization, where even the kind of minority Chinese shareholdership was then supposed to also be Zimbabwean. And that was one of the incidents that led to a real cooling down of relationships between China and Zimbabwe. So I think how these tools like the indigenization set of laws, how those are going to be used in the future is going to define a lot of how Chinese investment looks in the future in Zimbabwe. In relation to the Brits, Stephen, what do you think? Like, what was the UK's relationship with Mugabe up to now, and how is it going to go into the future?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was actually in Harare in June last year, and I managed to speak to the British High Commission there, and they told me, a quite senior diplomat said that they were at that point talking to all sides. At that point, Joyce Majuru was seen as being in the picture. Of course, she was the vice president that was fired in 2014 and then went and formed the Zimbabwe People First Party, noticed similar, same initials as ZANU-PF. and they had said that they were talking to all sides. At that point, so there certainly was contact. Of course, on the rhetorical level, there was a lot of criticism after the land invasions in 2000, and relations went very frosty thereafter. At that time, Tony Blair was in office, and of course, Mugabe loved to rail against Bush and Blair from his in his speeches, whether he was at the UN or on other international platforms. Britain was certainly behind sanctions being placed on Mugabe and his inner circle and a number of Zimbabwean officials. And so relationships have been quite difficult, but for sure they've been talking to Mnangagwa, and they still have substantial investments in Zimbabwe, and we'll have to wait and see, but I think they may well want to reinvest and re-engage to a greater extent now that President Mugabe himself, that very polarizing figure, has left the scene. Although, as you've said, Mnangagwa was at Mugabe's side for a lot of the problematic, well, certainly what the West sees as problematic incidents in Zimbabwean history. So if we work backwards, he was instrumental in the 2008 election campaign when it looked very clear that Changarai had won, and a second election was held, and there was an intimidation of voters. He was also involved in Operation Murabatsvina, which cleared the slums of Harare, and most notoriously was very involved in the early 1980s in the purges against the Ndebele tribe in Matabele land, where thousands and thousands of people were killed and tortured. So he's not starting from a clean slate.
No. But, when I was watching the events unfold over the past few days, as a China watcher, I really felt that this was an important moment. And I will express my biases up front that I do emphasize the China side of the equation oftentimes more than the other sides, just because I'm here and I see a lot more of it. But something really felt big and monumental about what happened. And I really believe that 20 years ago, if this was to happen, that Chiwenga would, he even if he had a regularly scheduled trip to Beijing, he would have changed his plans to go to Washington or to London or to Brussels. He would not have gone to Beijing. He went to Beijing. He didn't go to a Western capital. He didn't go anywhere. He didn't even go to South Africa. He went to Beijing. He went to talk with the Chinese leadership. We don't know about what, and there is absolutely no way to accurately speculate about what. So for me, this was symbolic in many ways about what Chiwenga did. Does this represent, am I reading too much into it? A lot of the international press coverage shares my sense that something happened here, that Zimbabwe represents Africa's new direction towards China away from the West. And did you see that as well in what you were reading and the people you're talking with, or did something else come up? Was this just really a coincidence that he went a week before the events unfolded?
So I think it's, as you say, we're not flies on the wall and we don't know what was actually said. But if you saw the way that the military operation was executed, it had clearly been thought out and planned. Some have said, I've heard it said that it was had to be pushed forward a few weeks because of the firing of Mnangagwa, and that galvanized the military and their opposition to Mugabe's wife Grace, who was seen as the next in line for power with Mnangagwa fired from the vice presidency. But indeed, I think it's very significant that there was a trip to China. We don't know what was said, and as you say, there have been official denials. I saw the Chinese embassy in South Africa also denied that this was anything but a routine visit. But it does seem like quite a significant coincidence because China's comments were quite mooted. I mean, in fact, I think everybody's comments when the initial military takeover took place, and they were very careful not to call it a coup d'état, because if it is a coup d'état, that triggers all sorts of condemnations and bannings from the Southern African Development Community, known as SADC, and the African Union. The country would be suspended, etc., etc. So it was a very strange coup. Some people have coined the phrase a democra coup, that it was something in between a coup d'etat and forcing the political needle. But I think the visit to Beijing is indeed significant.
Cobus, let me get your take on this as well, if I can. I really want to get your point of view on this because it's so important. And I think it's worth, before we hear what you have to say on this, prefacing that, remember, China of all countries really, really hates regime change. This is not in their language. It's very much in an American language and very much an American tradition. But the Chinese will stand by their man, even if their man is Robert Mugabe for a long time, who's past his for sale date. And they stand by him. And I guess my question for you is, Cobus, do you really believe that Chiwenga and Mnangagwa and all the other people involved in this would have gone forward if China said no? That is, China would have cut off its investments, China would have cut off its military trade, China would have cut off the limited amount of aid that it had. So do you think in some ways China was a linchpin, or was China just one of the many other countries that may have been informed about this and they would have gone ahead with it anyway?
Yeah, this is a difficult question to answer. My feeling is that the international press coverage of this incident has run roughshod a little bit about the distinction between whether China was simply informed and whether China was an instrumental actor, whether China was pushing for regime change and whether it was simply informed of a coming change of government. I would be much more comfortable going with the China was informed line rather than China was instrumentally pushing for something. That seems very far away from any kind of precedent, what we've seen in China's dealings with Africa before. And I mean, you can really not say enough bad things about Mugabe, but the Mugabe government wasn't as chaotic as in it wasn't a situation like in South Sudan, and even in a situation as dire as South Sudan, China is not kind of sending in some kind of secret service or using any of the tactics of regime change that we've seen the US use sometimes in the past. So, that feels to me too far. In terms of China simply being informed, that is itself significant, as you said. Like it's significant that China is informed, and then it becomes this very, very grey area where it seems. Yeah, the issue is whether they were simply told, well, this is happening, get ready, or whether there was a more of a discussion about timing or tactics or whatever. And there, I have no idea. But in generally, I would hazard a guess that they probably knew a little while before it happened that it was going to happen, but I don't know that they were necessarily more involved than that. Eric, what do you think?
I fully agree. There is, and again, we have to go on the evidence that we have, and this is what I said on LinkedIn, where I hosted a discussion about this, that we don't have any evidence that the Chinese were anywhere involved in this, and it really annoyed me to no end to see these headlines from even some reputable publications that implied that the Chinese were somehow the hand behind the Chiwenga troops as they moved through Harare. And we just don't have any evidence of that. And there is also, again, nowhere in the history that supports that type of behavior for the Chinese. In fact, the Chinese, after what happened in Libya with the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi and their abstention from UN Resolution 1972, which granted authorization for the United States and Europe to intervene in Libya, and the Chinese got really upset with how far that went and how they felt that the Americans and the French took that resolution and pushed it to regime change when it was only supposed to protect civilians. There was this sense in Beijing that says, we're not going to do this anymore. So we're never going to be a part of these types of regime changes. And so that is more of the instinct of the Chinese than to be playing this hand. And I think a lot of people, Cobus, you and I have talked about this so many times, they will take the Chinese and bring them into a Western colonial narrative, and it just doesn't fit. And I think that's probably what's going on. But I guess, Stephen, let me come to you about the precedent that might have been set here. Robert Mugabe is not the only dictator in Africa. Robert Mugabe is not the only unpopular leader in Africa. In fact, your own country has a highly unpopular leader. And so what we saw now over the past week was a bloodless coup, a way to avoid international sanctions, the blessing of some foreign governments, including the Chinese and the Americans, or maybe not the blessing, at least the abstention of any criticism. Do you get a sense that we might be in for a bumpy ride now for some of the other dictatorships or less than popular governments, either in the Southern African region or anywhere on the continent?
Well, I think a couple of things are important. One is the respect with which Mugabe was held in his country, even with all the many problems he's caused it over the last 37 years. So, we saw those photographs of him shaking hands with the military and that bizarre non-resignation speech on Sunday night. But I think in that country he was really, he was the founding father and is held in great esteem. I think some of the less democratic leaders in the continent are probably not sleeping as well as they used to. I think the context is very different though in every country. But what was also interesting for me was that once the tide had turned against Mugabe, I mean, his own party that he was so instrumental in founding and keeping in government was prepared to impeach him. They actually started impeachment proceedings. They were hoping it was going to go for a few days, and I think that tipped the balance and led to his resignation, even though he had the opportunity to resign on television the night before. And so he left, not in circumstances of his own choosing. I think that, other governments are going to be worried, but you also got to remember, I think, that the military is strong in many African states, and it's not only defending the borders, but usually defending state house, whether that's a militia or separately trained guards, etc. So, the Arab Spring began in Tunisia and soon spread to the other North African states. So we'll have to wait and see. But it presented this weird conundrum for the African Union and for SADC, because it was a coup in everything but name. But then we had, President Mugabe going on Friday morning to a graduation ceremony at the University of Zimbabwe, dressed in his robes, and appearing on TV with the generals flanking him. So very weird, very strange. And they seem to have got away with it because it was indeed, it was a military, non-democratic way of changing the leader of what we would call regime change. So I think the scholars are going to be mulling over this one for many weeks and months and years. But yeah, some embattled presidents may be thinking twice to see actually when the chips are down, your party can turn on you.
Yeah, so it seems like this was a unique situation. And the situation in Zimbabwe, in one way, though, is very typical of a growing number of African countries in terms of its relationship with China. China is Zimbabwe's top export market. It is the number one source of foreign direct investment, a staggering 74% now. And what's interesting is that was, relatively new over the past 15, 20 years. And the Chinese are also, delivering massive amounts of aid and investment. $4 billion was agreed to go in 2016, including $46 million for the building of the new parliament building in Harare. So the Chinese influence is only going to get stronger. And Cobus, I'm curious about what you think in terms of these relationships. And let's go back to the old friend thing, because it's not just Robert Mugabe. Mnangagwa also dates back to the 60s with the Chinese. And after he was ousted of his vice presidency in November, he too went to China. And so he has a lot of different relationships, deep relationships with the Chinese Communist Party. They go back a long time. Given China's role as the largest source of FDI, its largest trading partner, it's, of course, building the parliament building, and his own personal relationships, what are you forecasting now, looking forward in terms of Mnangagwa's approach to the international community, but specifically China?
Yeah, you're completely right. He received military training in China apparently during the anti-colonial struggle.
In the 60s, I think it was.
Yeah. And he also, both him and Constantino Chiwenga, they apparently have both benefited from the army's investment in the diamond fields, that was a kind of a co-investment between Chinese companies and the Zimbabwean army. So apparently they benefited from having a kind of a subsidiary that was invested in a Zimbabwean Chinese company, diamond company. That subsidiary was owned by figures within the military. So there's financial links there too, and then it becomes an issue about what one means when one says China, right? Because the relationship between Mugabe and the Communist Party and Mnangagwa and the Communist Party, that's one thing, these kind of diplomatic political relationships. But there's also strong commercial relationships, between Chinese companies and these figures in the Zimbabwean army. So, that raises a lot of questions about how these things are going to be balanced. But I think the one thing it makes clear is that China's pretty much there to stay, I think. I don't think, I would be surprised if there was a significant diminishment of Chinese involvement in Zimbabwe over the next few years. What I'm wondering is, to a large extent, these two, the Mnangagwa and Chiwenga, are kind of old guard. I mean, Mnangagwa is in his 70s. And so they're roughly the same, slightly younger, with the same kind of generation and also political, army-linked political ZANU people as Mugabe was. Stephen, what do you think is going to happen to the group of younger politicians that were supporting Grace Mugabe, and then also to the official opposition, the MDC? Well, how do you think things are going to shake out for them?
Yeah, interesting, because the way that the military takeover was played certainly in the Zimbabwean media when the general the general was announcing the action. It was also seen as rounding up elements that were destabilizing the state, and those were indeed Grace Mugabe's G40 faction, G40 standing for Generation 40, roughly people in their 40s, but some of them a bit older than that, but as distinct from Mnangagwa's faction, which is known as largesse, after his nickname, the crocodile, so very poetic. Many of them were detained. Apparently some left the country. In fact, I saw a report earlier today that at least one minister was tortured while he was taken. So it's I think Mnangagwa has a few jobs to do, and one of which is trying to hold the party together and reaching out to the other faction. The opposition is incredibly splintered. I mean, the Movement for Democratic Change that Morgan Tsvangirai leads has split more than once and splintered. You still have you have Joyce Majuru's party that I mentioned earlier. You have Tendai Biti, the former foreign minister, who has his own party. There have been attempts to try and unite, but so far no great announcements, and we have to see. I think ZANU-PF will be very keen to go for elections which are scheduled for June, July next year, and the opposition to me doesn't look very strong, even though they've come very close to winning elections before, and many have said that in fact they probably did win some of the elections that have been held, but the results were falsified and there was cheating and fraud and so forth to keep ZANU-PF in power. And don't forget, ZANU-PF is an incredibly powerful political party that knows how to win elections by hook or by crook.
Well, if you love international politics and international relations, it doesn't get any more fascinating and entertaining than what we're seeing here in Zimbabwe. Stephen Grusz is the head of governance and foreign policy programs at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and he is following this very, very closely. If you want to follow Stephen and what SAIA is doing, head over to their Twitter feed at SAIA_info. That's SAIIA_info, INFO. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light on what is just an absolutely fascinating series of events that have happened and will no doubt be equally interesting to watch going forward in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. I've enjoyed chatting to you guys.
Cobus, taking a step back from everything that's happened, and you and I have been following this quite closely over the past week or two to see all of the different facets of the events. I think what surprised me the most was not actually the China visit by Chiwenga or the fact that Mnangagwa has such deep ties to China. I think there's going to be a continuity of Chinese policy in Zimbabwe. I think the Zimbabweans are going to really work hard to attract the Chinese to come in, because I think they're the main source of investment and potentially aid and offering some stability in their foreign policy. But I guess what surprised me the most was we didn't hear any role for the United States. We didn't hear the State Department loudly condemning a coup or supporting a coup. In fact, remember, the United States doesn't even have an Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. There's no one in charge. And in some ways, again, this is what goes back to what I said in the earlier part of the program, that it feels like something big happened here. Even though Zimbabwe geopolitically is insignificant for either Beijing or Washington, it doesn't have the strategic importance that Djibouti has. It doesn't have the resources in the volumes that the DR Congo has. It's got diamonds, great. It's got minerals, great. It has tobacco, great. But those are things that the Chinese and other investors can find elsewhere. It doesn't have that strategic value that other countries have. But yet still, something fascinating happened here.
It also, as you said, it looks like a kind of a shift in the geopolitical order. You know, perhaps particularly the part of the geopolitical order where big countries are commenting on what's going on in small countries. That the fact that the Trump administration was so quiet on this and seemed to maybe not have noticed it particularly, or it didn't feel particularly kind of called on to become involved. That itself is interesting. I mean, especially considering that China was so involved.
But that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
No, it wouldn't have happened under Obama.
I mean, and I don't even want to put this at the foot of Donald Trump. I think Obama was as disengaged from Africa in some ways as Trump is. I mean, he had the pretense of it, but the substance of his Africa policy was more or less what we're seeing today for the most part.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like Obama was disengaged in Africa generally, but I think in this case, I mean, if this were just like for, magically still the Obama era, I think the Obamas would have said something at least.
You gotta think they would have.
Really?
Yeah, but it just, the world is changing, and this is an example of it. And so stepping back a little bit even farther, what I've been watching here is watching the 18th Party Congress, where Xi Jinping solidified his power in a way that we have not seen in a Chinese leader for decades. Some say all the way back to Mao Zedong himself, that a Chinese leader has not had this consolidation of power. So he's strong, he's confident, he's got the government and the military firmly aligned behind him. And then we had the Trump visit here, where in many ways that too was a turning point in international affairs, where China really was at the table with the Americans as equals. And that is not something we've seen before in previous Sino-US visits, where it was always the Americans imposing demands on the Chinese, things like human rights, trade. Trump forced them to make no concessions whatsoever. And I think the Chinese and the reaction here in China after Trump left was, we are now officially equal with the United States. And that was something significant. And then on top of this, a couple weeks later, we have the Chiwenga visit to Beijing. And it just feels for me that, again, we're seeing, as you pointed out, the pieces on the chessboard are moving right now. And that just feels important to me. Again, I might be reading more into it than it deserves, but it's a feeling that something important is going on here.
And there's also a feeling, just being in Southern Africa, that hopefully there's some change coming in Southern Africa. Mugabe is gone. I mean, that's massive news. But for me, what went under the radar, and we will hopefully do a podcast about this soon, actually, is also that Jose Eduardo dos Santos of Angola is gone. Another generation-long reign.
Another long friend of the Chinese as well, an old friend of the Chinese as well.
Exactly. So kind of it feels like there's these kind of tectonic plates in Southern African politics that are shifting, and that hopefully there'll be some form of greater economic development with it.
So the last point is, I'm not as optimistic as you are, because the lesson that came out of the Arab Spring was these types of tumultuous overthrows of government tend not to lead to stability and economic development. That is one of the lessons that emerged from it. And I think it's interesting. So the question is, what kind of leader will Mnangagwa become? Will he become a Paul Kagame in Rwanda? And this is where, again, the connection with the Chinese will be very important. What type of reforms does he focus on? Is he going to model his economy more on the so-called Beijing consensus, the idea of a strong state-controlled, authoritarian capitalist economy that Paul Kagame and that Beijing advocate around the world? Or will he open up reforms according to the Washington consensus, a liberal democracy, make it easier for foreign investors, you loosen the reins on political control? I'm highly, highly skeptical that he will do that. I tend to think he will follow more in the Kagame model. Or will he follow in the Mugabe model? And the Mugabe model is just raping and pillaging and fleecing the place, which he's done pretty well, it seems like, Mnangagwa over my guess is he's not poor. He probably has some apartments and some Swiss bank accounts. That's all speculation on my part. I don't have any personal knowledge on that. But Cobus, final question to you on this. Of those three, where do you think we will be a year from now?
There's going to be a lot of continuity from the Mugabe era, because Mnangagwa was so instrumental in a lot of the things that Mugabe did. So I don't think it's necessarily going to change that much. There is indications that in the short term, there's been some crackdowns on petty corruption, which apparently is, Zimbabweans are happy about. And then China is going to definitely be a massive player. They're going to continue to be a massive player, and I would suggest the UK is going to be a massive player, and South Africa, and between those three, we'll see what happens.
Okay. Well, there is a very lively discussion going on about all things related to Zimbabwe over on our Facebook page at facebook.com/China Africa Project. In fact, in our newsletter, our email newsletter that goes out every Monday, almost every story was about the Chinese foreign policy implications of what happened in Zimbabwe. And then over on my LinkedIn page, you can find me at Eric Olander, EricOlander. Almost 500,000 people are discussing all of the different facets of China's engagement in Africa with a particular attention on Zimbabwe. So this is really a hot topic right now. Lots of people are writing about it, thinking about it, discussing it. So are we. We will continue this discussion. I have to say it was a little bit tough for us to find a guest. So we are going to keep looking for guests to talk about this. We struggled this week, and thank goodness Stephen was available, but we will try to give more insights on what is happening in Southern Africa right now, both Angola and in Zimbabwe. So for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show, or follow China Africa News that's updated every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadenesque or Eric at Olander. That's EOLANDER. Subscribe to the China Africa podcast on iTunes or download the mobile apps for iOS, Android, or Windows Phone. Just head over to your favorite store and search for China Africa.